At its prime, 35mm was by far the most ubiquitous format for shooting and projecting motion pictures throughout the world. Beginning with its standardization in the early 1900s, it evolved to become the go-to format for film distributors and cinemas for most of the 20th century. Though the format was recently succeeded by the advent of digital cinematography and projection starting in the early 2000s, 35mm motion picture film still stands as the most influential format for image capturing and distribution ever. The creation of the 35mm format began over 120 years ago in Thomas Edison's laboratory. William Dickson, Edison's associate, was fascinated by capturing moving images and created devices to do so on film loops that were 35mm wide. The width was created by slitting 2.75-inch film rolls that were supplied by George Eastman in half and adding perforations. Though Dickson created the format, it took Kodak several years to make this 35mm film stock a regular product, and it was commonly referred to as Edison's format. Before 35mm, there was a wide variety of proprietary film gauges devised for multiple different camera and projection systems. Due to this, cameras and projectors had to be specifically calibrated to a certain gauge, and film often came unperforated, with the filmmaker needing to punch the perforations with special equipment that worked for their gauge standards. The 35mm format was the first format to become dominant among film cameras and projection systems, mostly due to its size compared to other film gauges. 35mm allowed for the best trade-off between the cost of the film stock and the quality of the images captured, as a larger frame size would produce a better picture, but would come at a higher manufacturing cost. 35mm was what most studios considered the sweet spot for both image quality and price, which led it to become the official standard of the then newly formed Motion Picture Patents Company, a trust established by Edison in 1909. This standardization called for the 35mm gauge with 4 perf Edison perforations and a 1.33 to 1 aspect ratio. This was a huge step in the development and spread of cinema, as filmmakers and theaters everywhere were using the same standard format, allowing films to be distributed easier to more theaters, in turn causing them to be seen by more people. While Edison's format was an extremely important part of the evolution of cinema, it wasn't perfect. The main issue was that the format had no way of reproducing sound, and while silent films were extremely popular for most of the late 1910s and throughout the 20s, the next logical step was to be able to include fully synchronized sound. Warner Brothers attempted this using synchronized phonograph discs, most notably with the release of The Jazz Singer in 1927, but this made projection more difficult, with projectionists being responsible to sync up the phonograph disc with the film. The process needed to be automatic. The sound needed to be on the film itself. This led Fox to create in 1927 what eventually became the Academy format. The Academy format had a 1.375 to 1 aspect ratio. Similar to the Edison format, it used frames that were 4 perforations tall, but shrunk the frame size down to include some extra space beside it for an optical soundtrack. By 1929, movie studios revamped the format in order to create the older 1.33 to 1 aspect ratio. In November 1929, the Society of Motion Pictures Engineers set a standard aperture ratio of 0.800 inches by 0.600 inches, known as the 1930 standard, in order to once again standardize film capturing and projection practices. In 1932, the standard was refined to enlarge the aperture and create a standard aperture plate size of 21mm by 15mm. Once again making the aspect ratio 1.375 to 1. The gauge has been extremely versatile. As time has gone by, different forms of 35mm film have been created to widen the aspect ratio of the image. Since the 50s, standard 35mm has been altered to create aspect ratios like the standard flat 1.85 to 1 American widescreen aspect ratio and the French 2.35 to 1 scope anamorphic aspect ratio, the latter being produced by using an anamorphic projection lens to literally unsqueeze the image at projection time. The format has also evolved to include color and stereo sound and tighter grain structure for increased sharpness and detail. Multiple studios, including Paramount and Universal, also shot some films in 3-perf and even 2-perf Techniscope pull-downs in order to reduce film consumption and production costs. However, the films shot with these techniques were often criticized for their washed-out colors and loss of detail as compared to films shot on standard 35mm. The 35mm format was a mainstay for image capturing and projection for nearly a century until the advent of digital video projection in the early 21st century. After initial problems with video image quality such as low resolution, lack of latitude, and aliasing were overcome, the benefits of digital projection made standard 35mm film projectors obsolete to large theater chains, in turn stopping the distribution of new films on 35mm. While the format has been largely abandoned, many smaller independently owned theaters still proudly project movies in 35mm, keeping the groundbreaking format alive today. Thank you very much. My name is Kyle Swartz. I'm an independent student filmmaker from Portland, Oregon, and please don't forget to keep supporting the Cinema Literacy Initiative. Cheers.